March 1943, Stalag Luft III, 75 miles southeast of Berlin. The compound designated for American Army Air Force officers was a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by double rows of barbed wire, guard towers positioned every 100 meters, seismographic microphones buried along the perimeter to detect tunneling, searchlights that turned night into harsh artificial day. Lieutenant Robert Hansen of the 8th Air Force, shot down over Schweinfurt 2 months earlier, stood in Barracks 104 examining what appeared to be garbage, flattened toothpaste tubes collected from dozens of prisoners, their metal carefully cleaned and straightened, spread across a bunk like surgical instruments awaiting operation. Beside them lay wire stripped from mattress springs, bits of carbon scraped from burned wood, fragments of headphones salvaged from a destroyed German radio, and a coil of copper liberated from the camp electrical system during a carefully orchestrated, accidental power failure. Technical Sergeant Raymond Mitchell, a former radio engineer from Detroit, arranged these materials with the concentration of a jeweler sorting diamonds. "This is insane," Hansen said, though his voice carried wonder rather than criticism. "You're trying to build a radio receiver from trash." Mitchell looked up, his eyes bright with the particular madness that captivity bred in creative minds. "Not trying, Lieutenant. Building. We'll have it operational in 2 weeks. And once we're hearing BBC broadcasts, we'll know when to run." American airmen arrived at Stalag Luft III with certain advantages over other prisoners of war. They were officers, entitled under Geneva Convention to treatment befitting their rank, adequate food, exemption from forced labor, access to Red Cross parcels, the right to organize their own internal camp structure. The German Luftwaffe, which administered the camp, maintained relatively professional standards, viewing captured airmen as fellow warriors worthy of respect, despite enmity. Unlike camps in the East where Soviet prisoners died by the thousands from deliberate starvation and brutality, Stalag Luft III operated within recognizable bounds of military conduct. But captivity remained captivity. The prisoners lived in overcrowded barracks, survived on rations supplemented by Red Cross packages that arrived irregularly, endured cold that penetrated the thin walls during German winters, watched the sky filled with American bombers flying missions they could no longer join. The psychological weight of imprisonment was more crushing than physical hardship. The uncertainty about war's duration, the separation from family, the frustration of being sidelined while history unfolded overhead, the knowledge that their combat careers had ended before completing their missions. Within this environment, 2 cultures emerged. Some prisoners accepted captivity passively, focused on survival and waiting for liberation, filled their days with sports and theater and language classes, organized by the camp's senior officers. Others, temperamentally unable to accept imprisonment, dedicated themselves to escape, not because escape was likely to succeed, but because attempting it preserved agency, maintained the fiction that they remained active participants in the war rather than passive victims of circumstance. The Escape Committee, known formally as the X Organization, operated as a clandestine military unit within the camp. It maintained security protocols, assigned roles, coordinated complex operations involving hundreds of men, all under the constant surveillance of German guards who knew escape attempts were underway, but could not always prevent them. The committee's most famous operation would be the Great Escape of March 1944, when 76 officers escaped through a tunnel before recapture led to the execution of 50 by the Gestapo. But before the tunnels, before the mass escape, the X Organization needed intelligence. Specifically, they needed access to accurate news about the war's progress, when Allied forces might reach Germany, where the front lines stood, whether operations were planned that might create opportunities for escape or liberation. The Germans provided newspapers, but these were propaganda, unreliable, designed to demoralize prisoners with reports of German victories and Allied failures. The truth required access to BBC broadcasts, which meant building a radio receiver without proper components, without tools, without any of the basic materials radio construction required. Raymond Mitchell had been a radio engineer for RCA before the war, designing commercial receivers in the golden age when radio was America's primary entertainment and information medium. He understood electronics with the intuitive grasp that comes from years of practical experience, not just theory from textbooks, but the accumulated knowledge of what worked, what failed, how to improvise when proper components were unavailable. When he arrived at Stalag Luft III in February 1943, The escape committee immediately recognized his value. Within days of his arrival, senior officers approached him with a question. Could he build a radio receiver from materials available in the camp? Mitchell's initial assessment was discouraging. A radio receiver required specific components: vacuum tubes or crystal detectors for demodulation, capacitors for tuning, inductors for filtering, a power source, an antenna, headphones or speakers for output. None of these existed in the camp in usable form. The Germans had confiscated all electronic equipment, swept the camp regularly for contraband, punished prisoners discovered with prohibited items. Building a radio would require not just technical skill but elaborate deception, coordination with dozens of other prisoners, sustained effort over weeks or months. But Mitchell was also a problem solver, trained in the Depression-era ethos of making do with what you had. He began by inventorying available materials. Toothpaste tubes were aluminum, a decent conductor. Wire could be obtained from mattresses, from damaged electrical fixtures, from broken musical instruments. Carbon for resistors could be scraped from burned wood. Insulators could be fashioned from wax, from cardboard soaked in paraffin from Red Cross cheese parcels. A crystal detector, the simplest form of demodulator used in early radios before vacuum tubes, could potentially be created from lead and sulfur, materials obtainable through various means. The power source was more challenging. Crystal radios could operate without power, running on the electromagnetic energy of radio waves themselves, but their reception was weak and required excellent antennas. Mitchell decided on a hybrid approach: build a crystal receiver supplemented by a single vacuum tube if one could be obtained, powered by batteries that might be available from the camp infirmary, where they powered medical equipment. Over several weeks, Mitchell designed the receiver on paper, calculating inductance values, determining capacitor requirements, sketching circuit diagrams from memory. The design was crude by commercial standards, but theoretically functional. The real challenge would be obtaining components and assembling them without detection, a process that would require the X organization's full resources and the cooperation of dozens of prisoners willing to risk punishment for an operation that might fail completely. The procurement operation began with toothpaste tubes. Every prisoner received toiletries in Red Cross parcels: soap, toothpaste, shaving cream, items that maintained minimal hygiene and morale. The tubes were aluminum, thin but workable, large enough to be flattened into sheets suitable for fabricating capacitor plates and antenna elements. The escape committee put out a call. Every prisoner should save empty toothpaste tubes, deliver them to designated collectors, no questions asked. Within a month, over 200 tubes had been accumulated, cleaned, flattened, sorted by size and condition. Wire procurement was more dangerous. The camp's electrical system was monitored and theft of wire would be noticed. But the system occasionally failed. Bulbs burned out, connections loosened, fixtures required maintenance. The prisoners who worked maintenance details, supervised by German guards, developed techniques for accidentally breaking connections in ways that allowed them to pocket short lengths of wire. A broken fixture might yield a meter of copper wire. A damaged light switch produced brass contacts, suitable for other purposes. Over weeks, small thefts accumulated into workable quantities. The most difficult component was the crystal detector. Early radios had used galena, lead sulfide crystals contacted with thin wire, the famous cat's whisker detectors that had made radio accessible to hobbyists before vacuum tubes. Mitchell needed lead and sulfur to create a crude version. Lead came from the camp infirmary, X-ray shielding contained lead sheets, and a sympathetic American medical officer accidentally damaged a piece of equipment, making the lead available for disposal. Sulfur was obtained by trading cigarettes to a German guard who brought matches, from which sulfur could be extracted. The assembly took place in Barracks 104, in a space beneath the floor accessed through a carefully concealed trapdoor. Prisoners had excavated a small chamber, shored it with boards, created a hiding place that German searches had not discovered. Mitchell worked there by candlelight, his hands steady despite the crude conditions, soldering connections with makeshift tools, testing components with instruments fashioned from compass needles and wire. The work was painstaking, requiring precision that seemed impossible given the materials and conditions. Other prisoners supported the operation through elaborate deception. Stooges, lookouts positioned throughout the camp, tracked German guard movements, provided warning when searches were imminent. Diversionary activities drew guard attention away from Barracks 104. Noise cover, Prisoners singing, playing makeshift instruments, conducting athletic competitions, masked the sounds of Mitchell's work. The operation required coordination among dozens of men, all risking solitary confinement or worse if discovered, all committed to the belief that intelligence was worth the risk. The psychological dimensions of the project were as significant as the technical challenges. Building the radio gave the involved prisoners purpose, transformed them from passive captives to active resistors. Mitchell found himself working 16-hour days, exhausted but energized, his engineering skills finally useful after months of forced idleness. Lieutenant Hansen, who had questioned the project initially, became the security coordinator, organizing the lookout system, creating elaborate schedules that ensured German searches never coincided with Mitchell's work periods. The project also created internal tensions. Some prisoners believed escape attempts were futile, that they risked German retaliation for little gain, that patience and waiting for liberation was wiser strategy. Others worried that a discovered radio would result in collective punishment, reduced rations, canceled privileges, increased restrictions. The camp's senior officer, Colonel Harrison, had to mediate between factions, ultimately supporting the radio project while acknowledging the risks. "We're officers in the Army Air Force," he said during a barracks meeting. "Our duty is to resist captivity by all means consistent with military honor. Building a radio for intelligence gathering serves that duty. We proceed." The German guards were not naive. They knew prisoners attempted escapes, knew contraband existed despite searches, knew the Americans were resourceful and determined. Routine inspections became more frequent, more thorough. Guards probed walls, floors, ceilings, searching for tunnels and hiding places. They confiscated suspicious materials, interrogated prisoners about activities that seemed coordinated. The game of deception and counter-deception became increasingly sophisticated, each side adapting to the other's tactics. One close call occurred in April 1943, when a German guard noticed unusual foot traffic around Barracks 104. He ordered an immediate search, arriving with 4 subordinates to conduct a thorough inspection. The prisoners had perhaps 5 minutes warning, enough time to seal the trapdoor, scatter the lookouts, arrange themselves in apparently innocent activities. Mitchell, trapped beneath the floor with partially assembled radio components, waited in darkness while German boots walked overhead, while guards probed and questioned and examined. The search lasted 2 hours. The guards found nothing. Mitchell emerged after dark, shaking with released tension, more determined than ever to complete the project. "They're getting suspicious," Hansen warned. "We need to finish soon or abandon the attempt." Mitchell nodded, calculating rapidly. 2 more weeks. I need 2 weeks to complete assembly and testing. Then we'll know if it works. The timeline was aggressive, requiring sustained effort without mistakes, without detection. But the alternative, abandoning the project after months of work, was unacceptable. They would push forward. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A new prisoner, Captain William Jennings, arrived at Stalag Luft III in late April 1943, shot down during a raid on Bremen. During intake processing, prisoners routinely attempted to smuggle small items past German searches, family photographs, good luck charms, occasionally more valuable contraband. Jennings searched 3 times, successfully concealed a small vacuum tube he had removed from his bomber's emergency radio before bailing out. The tube was a 1N34 germanium diode, not perfect for radio reception, but vastly superior to the crystal detector Mitchell had been attempting to fabricate. Jennings, learning about the radio project, offered the tube to Mitchell with the matter-of-fact generosity that characterized prisoner cooperation. "I kept it thinking it might be useful. Sounds like you need it more than I do." The gift was enormous. The tube simplified the receiver design, improved anticipated performance, potentially reduced detection risks by shortening assembly time. Mitchell incorporated it immediately, redesigning several circuit elements to optimize the tube's characteristics. The antenna was the final challenge. Radio reception required a wire long enough to capture electromagnetic waves, ideally, dozens of meters stretched as high as possible. But any visible antenna would be spotted immediately, confiscated, result in investigation and punishment. The solution required creativity that bordered on madness. The prisoners would use the camp's barbed wire fencing as an antenna, carefully connecting to it with a wire that appeared to be part of the fence's structure, running the signal back to the receiver through buried cable disguised as drainage improvements. The connection operation took place during a night with new moon. Maximum darkness between searchlight sweeps. Lieutenant Tom Morrison, a former college athlete with steady nerves, crawled the 50 meters from Barracks 104 to the fence, carrying wire and makeshift connection tools. The guards in the nearest tower were distracted by prisoners staging an argument in the adjacent compound, shouting loudly enough to draw attention. Morrison made the connection in 4 minutes, buried the lead wire under a thin layer of dirt, crawled back without triggering the perimeter sensors. The operation was textbook, planned meticulously, executed flawlessly, succeeding through coordination and nerve. With the antenna connected, the receiver was theoretically complete, but theory and practice were different things. Mitchell needed to test reception, tune the circuits, determine whether months of work had produced a functional radio or an elaborate piece of junk. The test was scheduled for April 28, 1943, at 2100 hours, when BBC broadcast its nightly news service, when the camp was relatively quiet, when guards were tired and less vigilant. The night of April 28th, Barracks 104 was tense with anticipation. 30 prisoners crammed into the space, ostensibly for a poker tournament that provided cover for the real activity. Mitchell and Hansen descended to the chamber beneath the floor, carrying the receiver assembly, a set of headphones salvaged from a German radio destroyed during construction, and a faith born of desperation rather than confidence. The receiver looked absurd, a tangle of wire and flattened toothpaste tubes, components held together with solder made from melted tin cans, the whole assembly mounted on a board that had once been part of a bunk bed. Mitchell connected the headphones, adjusted the crystal detector with hands that trembled slightly despite his attempt at professional detachment, and began tuning the variable capacitor he had constructed from interleaved aluminum sheets. The capacitor's adjustment was crude, rotating one set of plates relative to another using a wooden shaft, but it allowed tuning across the broadcast band where BBC operated. He swept slowly through frequencies, hearing nothing but static, then a faint whistle that suggested a carrier wave, then voices speaking German, a Wehrmacht station broadcasting propaganda. He continued tuning, his concentration absolute, Hansen watching with barely controlled anxiety. Then faintly, almost drowned in static but unmistakably present, "This is London," the BBC's signature opening, as familiar to British and American listeners as any sound in the world. Mitchell's face split into a grin. "We've got it. We've got BBC." He adjusted the detector, trying to improve reception, reducing static incrementally. The voice became clearer. "Here is the news from London. Allied forces in North Africa have captured Tunis." Hansen erupted from the chamber, burst into the barracks above, shouting, "It works, the radio works." The poker game dissolved into celebration, prisoners shaking hands, pounding backs, laughing with relief and triumph. They had done it. Using garbage and ingenuity, under constant surveillance risking punishment, they had built a functioning radio receiver that could access uncensored news about the war's progress. Mitchell remained below, listening to the broadcast with professional satisfaction, making notes about signal strength and tuning characteristics, already planning improvements. The receiver was crude, reception was weak and unstable, but it functioned. They could hear BBC. They had intelligence the Germans couldn't control. The balance of power in the camp had shifted subtly, but significantly. Knowledge was power, and they now had access to knowledge the Germans wanted, denied them. The radio's existence transformed camp dynamics. The X organization established protocols for its use, listening sessions twice daily, at times when BBC broadcast news, with elaborate security to prevent detection. News was transcribed, memorized by designated prisoners who could recall details without written notes, then disseminated through the camp via a controlled distribution system. The Germans knew prisoners had access to information. They noticed that morale rose after Allied victories, fell after setbacks, but they could not locate the source despite repeated searches. The intelligence gathered was invaluable for escape planning. By May 1943, BBC broadcasts made clear that Allied invasion of Italy was imminent, that Germany was suffering serious reverses in Russia, that the war had turned decisively against the Axis. This information affected escape strategy. The X organization began planning for long-distance escapes toward Switzerland or Sweden, rather than attempting to hide near the camp and wait for liberation, since liberation appeared months or years away. But the radio's mere existence created danger. The Germans intensified their searches, brought in electronic detection equipment that could theoretically locate operating receivers. interrogated prisoners more aggressively. In July 1943, a Gestapo officer arrived at the camp, a sinister development since the Luftwaffe normally maintained control, and the Gestapo's involvement suggested that higher authorities had become concerned about intelligence leaks. The Gestapo officer, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber, was intelligent and patient. He understood that crude searches would not locate a well-hidden radio, that interrogation of disciplined officers would yield little. Instead, he studied patterns: who moved where, when barracks experienced increased activity, which prisoners showed knowledge inconsistent with what German-controlled information sources provided. He was building a case through observation, narrowing possibilities, preparing to strike when certainty justified action. Mitchell, aware of the increased scrutiny, proposed moving the radio to a different location. Barracks 104 is compromised. They're watching us. We need to relocate before they find it. But moving was dangerous. Transport increased discovery risks. Setting up a new hiding place required construction that might be detected. After intense debate, the X-organization decided to keep the radio in place but reduce usage frequency, hoping decreased activity would make patterns less visible. The decision was reasonable but ultimately inadequate. Weber was too skilled, too patient, too thorough. By August 1943, he had narrowed his focus to 3 barracks, including 104. He ordered simultaneous searches of all 3, using teams large enough to conduct thorough inspections, preventing prisoners from moving contraband during the operation. The search of Barracks 104 began at dawn on August 12, 1943. The Germans arrived with 20 guards, more than enough to control the barracks and conduct methodical inspection. They ordered all prisoners outside, lined them up in formation, began systematic search while Weber supervised. The prisoners watched helplessly as guards probed walls, ceilings, floors. The trapdoor beneath Barracks 104 was well concealed, but the search was thorough, professional, informed by suspicion that something significant was hidden. 30 minutes into the search, a guard's probe penetrated the floor, revealing hollow space beneath. Weber smiled thinly, ordered the floorboards removed. Guards descended into the chamber, emerging minutes later with the radio receiver, antenna wire, notes about broadcast schedules, evidence of months of illegal activity. Weber examined the device with something approaching respect. "Ingenious," he said in accented English. "Built from garbage. American resourcefulness is impressive." He ordered the arrest of Mitchell, Hansen, and 3 other officers closely associated with the radio project. They were taken to the camp's detention building, held in isolation while Weber prepared charges. The rest of the camp waited anxiously, uncertain what punishment would follow. Under Geneva Convention, attempting escape was not criminal. It was expected military behavior, punishable by brief detention, but not by serious penalty. But espionage was different. Building a radio could be characterized as intelligence gathering, potentially subject to harsher punishment. Colonel Harrison, the camp's senior American officer, intervened. He requested meeting with the camp commandant, argued forcefully that the radio was for morale purposes only, that prisoners had no way to transmit intelligence even if they gathered it, that punishing officers for behavior consistent with their duty to resist captivity would violate the spirit of Geneva Convention protections. The commandant, a Luftwaffe officer who maintained correct relations with his prisoners, was sympathetic, but firm. "I understand your position, Colonel, but the Gestapo is involved now. The matter is beyond my authority." Weber interrogated the arrested prisoners individually, seeking information about how the radio was built, who had helped, whether other contraband existed in the camp. Mitchell refused to provide information beyond confirming he had built the receiver. "I'm an engineer. I built a radio from available materials. That's all I'll say." The others maintained similar positions. Acknowledgement of basic facts, refusal to implicate other prisoners, or provide details about X-organization operations. After a week of interrogation that involved no physical abuse but considerable psychological pressure, Weber made his decision. The prisoners would be punished with 30 days solitary confinement. The radio would be destroyed. The camp would face increased restrictions. But there would be no courts-martial, no execution, no transfer to Gestapo custody. Mitchell and the others served their 30 days in isolation, small cells with minimal light, reduced rations, no contact with other prisoners. The experience was harsh, but survivable, designed to punish without permanently damaging. Mitchell used the time to mentally design improvements to the radio, planning for the day when they might build another, despite the increased risks. Hansen used the isolation to develop more sophisticated security protocols, analyzing where their operation had been compromised, how detection might be avoided in future attempts. When they were released in September 1943, they returned to a camp that had adapted to the radio's loss. Morale had dropped. Prisoners felt blind again, cut off from reliable news about the war's progress. But the experience had also strengthened their resolve. They had proven that innovation and determination could overcome resource limitations, that German surveillance was not perfect, that resistance was possible even in closely monitored captivity. The X organization immediately began planning a replacement radio. Mitchell, despite his recent punishment, volunteered to lead the effort. "We know their search patterns now," he argued. "We know how they found the first one. We can build better, hide smarter, operate more carefully." The organization agreed, but with stringent conditions. The new radio would have multiple hiding places that it could be moved between. Usage would be limited to absolutely necessary broadcasts. Distribution of information would be even more restricted to prevent patterns Weber could detect. The second radio, built through autumn 1943, incorporated lessons from the first. The design was simpler, using fewer components, easier to disassemble and relocate. The antenna system was redesigned to use multiple connection points, making it harder to trace. The hiding place was more elaborate, a chamber dug beneath a latrine building, accessed through a tunnel the Germans were unlikely to search due to the unpleasant environment. Construction took 4 months, involved over 50 prisoners, succeeded in remaining undetected despite German vigilance. By January 1944, the second radio was operational. Mitchell listened to BBC broadcasts reporting that Allied forces had landed at Anzio in Italy, that Soviet forces were advancing into Poland, that massive bomber raids were devastating German industrial capacity. The news confirmed what the prisoners had hoped. The war was turning decisively. Liberation was no longer distant possibility, but eventual certainty. The question was not whether Germany would lose, but when, and whether prisoners could survive until liberation or needed to attempt escape to increase their chances. The intelligence from the second radio shaped the planning for what would become the Great Escape of March 1944. The X organization learned through BBC broadcasts that Allied forces were preparing for invasion of France, that Soviet forces were approaching Poland's pre-war borders, that Germany faced military collapse on multiple fronts. This information suggested that spring 1944 was optimal timing for mass escape, early enough that Germany still had resources to maintain prisoner security, late enough that chaos of multiple front warfare might create opportunities for escaped prisoners to reach Allied or neutral territory. The tunnel operation, codenamed Harry, was extraordinarily ambitious, over 100 meters long, 9 meters deep, requiring disposal of hundreds of cubic meters of excavated sand, involving over 600 prisoners in various support roles. The radio played a crucial role in timing. BBC broadcasts indicated when Allied bomber raids would occur, allowing the tunnel team to schedule noisy excavation work to coincide with raid alerts, when guards were distracted and engine sounds masked digging noise. Mitchell, though not part of the actual escape attempt, his skills were too valuable to risk losing him to recapture or execution, provided technical support. He helped design air circulation systems for the tunnel, created improvised lighting using margarine lamps, solved engineering problems as they arose. The radio remained his primary contribution, providing intelligence that shaped strategic decisions and maintained morale through the long months of tunnel construction. The escape took place on the night of March 24-25, 1944. 76 men escaped through the tunnel before discovery led guards to seal it. The aftermath was tragic. 50 of the recaptured escapees were executed by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct orders, a war crime that shocked even the Luftwaffe officers administering the camp. The executions violated Geneva Convention protections, demonstrated that German respect for international law was collapsing as military situation deteriorated. Mitchell listened to BBC broadcasts reporting the executions, felt crushing guilt despite having no responsibility for the decisions that led to the escape attempt. The radio that had been built to save lives had indirectly contributed to deaths, not through malfunction or betrayal, but because the intelligence it provided had encouraged desperate action that ended in tragedy. The psychological burden was immense. Mitchell stopped eating regularly, withdrew from camp social life, questioned whether innovation and resistance were worth the costs they sometimes imposed. Lieutenant Hansen, released from his own isolation after the escape attempt, sought out Mitchell. "This isn't your fault," he said bluntly. "The Gestapo killed those men, not you, not the radio. We built it because knowledge matters, because blind captivity is its own death." The final year of captivity, from spring 1944 to liberation in May 1945, was marked by deteriorating conditions and growing certainty that survival was possible if prisoners endured long enough. The radio, now known to exist despite German inability to locate and destroy it, continued providing intelligence that shaped prisoner strategy. BBC broadcasts reported the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the liberation of Paris in August, the advance toward Germany's borders by autumn. Each report bolstered morale, confirmed that liberation was approaching, encouraged prisoners to avoid desperate actions that might result in death so close to freedom. The Germans, increasingly desperate as military situation collapsed, became simultaneously more dangerous and less organized. Guards were older, less disciplined, sometimes drunk. Food supplies dwindled as German logistics broke down. Winter 1944-45 was harsh, fuel for heating was scarce, Red Cross packages arrived sporadically. But the radio provided hope. BBC reported that Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, that Soviet forces were approaching Berlin, that Germany's defeat was imminent. In April 1945, with Allied forces approaching Stalag Luft III's location, the Germans evacuated the camp, forcing prisoners on a march westward away from Soviet advance. Mitchell carried components of the radio disassembled and hidden in his clothing, determined not to lose the device after 2 years of service. The march lasted 3 weeks, through chaos and collapsing infrastructure, ending when American forces overtook the column and liberated the prisoners in early May. Mitchell's first request after liberation was permission to send the radio to the Smithsonian Institution for preservation. "This device represents something important," he explained to the Army officer processing his repatriation. "It shows what ingenuity and determination can achieve even in captivity. It should be preserved as testimony to American resourcefulness." The officer, bemused but sympathetic, agreed to forward the request through proper channels. The radio, assembled from toothpaste tubes, mattress wire, and scavenged components, was eventually acquired by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, where it remains on display. The museum label reads, "Improvised radio receiver built by American POWs at Stalag Luft III, 1943-1945. Constructed from toothpaste tubes, wire, and salvage parts to receive BBC broadcasts. Demonstrates ingenuity, resistance, and determination of prisoners to maintain connection to the outside world, despite captivity. Thousands of visitors view it annually, most unaware of the full story. The risks taken, the close calls with discovery, the intelligence it provided, the lives it shaped. The moment of ultimate recognition came not during the war but decades later, at a reunion of Stalag Luft III survivors held in 1983. Mitchell, now 72 years old, had been invited to speak about the radio project. He stood before perhaps 100 former prisoners and their families, many of whom had been teenagers or young children when their fathers were imprisoned, and told the story of building a radio from garbage. As he spoke, describing the technical challenges and the elaborate deception required, he noticed tears on many faces. When he finished, one of the former prisoners stood, Lieutenant Morrison, who had crawled to the fence to connect the antenna wire 40 years earlier. "Ray, I want everyone here to understand something. That radio did more than provide news. It proved we weren't helpless. It showed us we could resist, could use our minds when physical escape was impossible. Every time we heard a BBC broadcast, we knew we were still fighting, still contributing, still relevant to the war's outcome even from behind barbed wire." Another veteran spoke. "I was planning suicide in August 1944. The captivity seemed endless, liberation impossible. Then someone shared news from the radio. Paris had been liberated. Allied forces were racing across France. That information saved my life. I decided to wait, to survive, to see freedom. The radio did that, gave me hope when I had none left." Story after story emerged. Prisoners whose morale had been sustained by the intelligence the radio provided, who had made decisions based on that intelligence that saved their lives or shaped their post-war futures. Mitchell, who had carried guilt about the 50 men executed after the Great Escape, finally understood that the radio's impact had been overwhelmingly positive. Yes, it had provided intelligence that encouraged the escape attempt, but it had also sustained thousands of prisoners through years of captivity, had maintained their connection to the world, had proved that ingenuity and resistance were possible even in the most controlled environments. His daughter, sitting in the audience, watched her father's face transform as he absorbed these testimonies. She had grown up knowing he had done something important during the war, but only now did she comprehend the full scope. Her father's engineering skills, applied under impossible conditions, had helped hundreds of men maintain their humanity and hope through years that might have broken them. That was worth building from toothpaste tubes. Raymond Mitchell died in 1997 at age 86, having lived 54 years beyond his liberation from Stalag Luft III. His obituary mentioned his wartime experience, the improvised radio, his post-war career returning to RCA where he helped develop early television technology. But the public details captured only surface facts. The deeper legacy lived in the families descended from prisoners whose morale his radio had sustained, whose hope had been maintained by access to uncensored information, who had survived captivity psychologically intact because they remained connected to the world beyond barbed wire. The radio itself, preserved in the Smithsonian, became a teaching tool. Engineering students studied its construction to understand improvisation and resource-constrained design. History students examined it as evidence of POW resistance. Museum visitors saw it as testimony to human ingenuity under pressure. The device was ugly, crude, held together with solder and hope, but it had functioned. That was enough. Function, not elegance, was what mattered when materials were garbage and the stakes were survival. The ex-organization members who had supported the radio project, the lookouts who had warned of German searches, the prisoners who had collected toothpaste tubes and scrounged wire, the diversionary actors who had distracted guards, remained connected through decades of reunions and correspondence. They had shared something profound, the experience of collaborative resistance, of using their skills and courage to maintain agency despite captivity, of proving that imprisonment could contain bodies but not minds or determination. Lieutenant Hansen, who had coordinated security for the radio project, spoke at Mitchell's funeral. Ray taught us that problems have solutions if you're creative enough to find them, that resources are wherever you look if you're willing to see potential instead of garbage, that captivity is a physical state, not a mental one. You remain free in your mind as long as you refuse to accept helplessness. The radio was just wire and metal, but what it represented was everything: hope, resistance, ingenuity, the unbreakable human spirit. Ray gave us that gift. We used it to survive. And we carried it forward into our lives, teaching our children that obstacles are opportunities, that limitations inspire innovation, that determination and creativity can overcome nearly any challenge. The Stalag Luft III radio, built from toothpaste tubes by American prisoners determined to remain connected to the world, stands as testimony to what humans can achieve when desperation meets ingenuity, when collaboration overcomes adversity, when the refusal to accept helplessness creates solutions from materials others would discard as worthless.